Hi everybody, thanks for coming. My name's Bethany and I am the Assistant Gallery Director here at the Montminy. Yes, thank you all for coming. I had the opportunity with this show to curate and to help design a show on my own, thanks to Kate kind of handing over the reins to me. And the first person that came to mind was Matt. I had him as a teacher when I was in the MFA program at Mizzou. I've known him for about 8 years now. It's hard to believe it's been that long. And yeah, one of the most passionate artists that I've ever had the pleasure of learning from. And so it's been a real pleasure to have his work in the gallery here. But yeah, passion, technique, it's all there, and thank you so much, Matt, for showing your work here. Thanks again for coming, and I will hand it over to Matt.
Thank you. So I mean, there's a lot of different directions that I could go with this, and I really want to focus on potentially having you all give me questions. So I will try not to talk too much. It's very easy for me as an educator. I've been at Mizzou for 12 years. It's very easy for me to just lecture for like 3 hours. Some people have experienced that. But what I'm going to try to do is in a quick fashion, try to give you a sense of what's happening in this space, because it really does incorporate about almost 20 years of thinking, with some gaps in between and some shifts of thought. But essentially, back in October of 2015, I was incensed by an event that took place. We had been in Afghanistan and Iraq for a very long time, almost 15 years at the time. And there was this one event that was kind of like a blip. It came up on some news feeds and then it went away. But it was a Doctors Without Borders hospital that was essentially bombed in a friendly fire incident. We misidentified where things were in the city of Kunduz, Afghanistan, and we actually knew that the target was about 3 blocks away, but instead, for well over an hour, we bombed this Doctors Without Borders hospital. There were no insurgents there, there were no enemy combatants there. It was all local populace and doctors who had traveled from around the world to try to be on the front line of helping civilian casualties. And I was very concerned about it. And it's actually funny, I see it every October. Facebook pops up and reminds me of my vitriol at the time. And so I did about 20 paintings that reflected on that incident. And 5 of them are right here, up close to us here. And I looked through documentary photographs, and I looked through videos, which many of them are posted on sites around the world, not necessarily on American news websites. They're on Al Jazeera, they're on The Guardian, they're on a number of places around the world. And essentially what I did is I began to pull images from those documentary photographs and videos and create visions of the impossibility of that space. So a hospital, a place where people are supposed to come to get healed, became an interior of immolation. Literally, people were burned alive. As people tried to leave, tried to get out, they were shot by the gunship that was hovering over the top of the hospital, and they were mowed down. And people from local commanders all the way up to President Obama, all the way up to the leadership of Afghanistan, gave a lot of excuses. But basically it was just, it was sort of passed off as, well, this is what happens when you're at war. And that's true. That is what happens when we're at war. And it's one of the reasons to fight against it. So those images really started to change and work in me. And for a couple of years I thought about them. And I thought maybe I was going to do them. And I thought maybe they were in my sketchbooks a little bit. But I had been starting to get a little disenchanted with working from the figure, working representationally. And so essentially what happened was that I had started to think about not working from the figure at all and just going back to compositional studies and abstractions and thinking about color. And of course, as a teacher, I'm always drawing. I'm always working in front of the students. They always see me working representationally. But in my own work, I had started to abandon it. And then in 2016, I had a heart attack, and as a result, I was trying to explain this earlier. I don't exactly know what happened, because I've always been very abstract compositionally. I mean, I think if you look around the room, you can see how it's not a straightforward compositional paradigm that I'm working from. It's a very modernist, abstract compositional format. But essentially what happened was that I felt that I could no longer look at and picture symbolically abstract ideas through the body. I felt like something about the figure, something about representational imagery was lost for me. And we could analyze and psychoanalyze why I felt that way in the weeks and months after my heart attack. And I've tried to think about what it means. But essentially, I abandoned it until about 6 months ago, when, like a force, those images from Kunduz came back to me. And the research that I had done, and I had a little file folder called Kunduz on my hard drive, and I kept clicking at it and looking at it and thinking about it, and thinking about those people. And I started to research again, and I found that there had been investigative journalism that had identified some of these civilians who had been killed inside. And I read their stories, and I heard about them, and I thought about them again. And so I decided that I needed to find a way to picture the impossible, to find some way to investigate the impossibilities that became real. And that's how I was able to reconnect to work that I had done in the past. Because I realized that some of what I've been activating in all my previous work was this tension between logic and reason on one hand and faith and belief on the other hand. And attempting to picture those things as almost like a prayer calling out saying, what does this mean? Why is this here? What is this for? And so in some sense, if you turn around and you see that picture of my head decapitated, getting ready to fall into a hole, you could say that that's morbid, or you could say that that is the feeling of being dislocated from knowledge, or being dislocated from the feeling of knowing what is going on, or being in a state of separation. And I think in so many ways, as you look throughout history, as you look through all the way back 80,000 years through the things that we have tried to picture, the body is the zone of incident. The body is the central sort of crux where we picture both how we understand who we are and how we don't understand who we are. And so all of these images, from the very newest ones to ones that I've recently been working back into, in fact, this large one over here on my left, this one back here, and the big square one out on the front wall, those ones are that I've been working on since 2006, 2007, on and off. I've never really settled on an end point for them. And so getting to work back into them over the course of the last few years in classes, I call my baby the color drawing class that I teach. That's really the one that I initiated at Mizzou and that I love and I work into all the time. And so many times I would pull out these large drawings and show them to my students as I'm working on them and give them a little vision of what it is that we can try to do in the depiction of these very strange tensions and the awkwardnesses in which we live. So that's kind of like the overall context in the background of this. Some of the work is about current events that are real, things that are happening. Some of these things are about personal tension, like who am I, what am I trying to do? Some of them actually ring very strangely true to the issues that we deal with. These two smaller pieces here, figures at a wall. Are they building that wall or are they tearing that wall down? What does the wall mean? This is a question that we, as a country, have been concerned about for a number of years now. And then, of course, back there behind Marcus, that suite of mezzotints done from Lamentations 3 in the Bible, a very awkward and hard passage. It's a passage about being broken and being destroyed and being crushed, right? We don't often think about the depiction of that side of things from biblical texts. And so, in a lot of ways, this work is about multiple perspectives on conflict, multiple perspectives on our experience of that conflict, and hopefully multiple perspectives on how we can understand something else out of that. As a final thought, before I take your questions, because I really want to take the question. I love questions. Questions make me happy. I think as a final thought, what I would say is that I really don't view anything as being done. Okay? Because my work is really for me, and it's about my own exploration of who I am and what I've been trying to do with my life. So, sometimes people are like, why would you keep working on it for years and years and years? When is it done? I think there are some things that are definitively done. But I think that for someone who is deeply engaged with the world, nothing is ever done. Everything is in a state of flux in a lot of ways. I think that we see that in our relationships. I think that we see that in our own mental state. I mean, every single day, the particular makeup of my brain chemistry and physical body is being shifted and changed, right? I often freak out my undergrads by telling them that they're breathing in each other's skin cells. So I think that when we realize that, the air that we're breathing is in part air that was in this hospital. Molecules of those incinerated bodies are part of us. And they'll be part of the ongoing history of the world. And I think that makes us think not only about our own complicity in these things that happen, but also that we, if we defy them, can make an actual difference in changing how those things function in the world. So, with that said, I want to hear questions. What do you want to challenge me on? What do you want clarity on? What do you think? Yes? Well, I think that one of the main reasons why I tend to ensconce the figure is that I want a witness. And what I mean by that is that, essentially we are the embodiment of the universe looking at itself. We are the conscious awareness of the universe. And so when I embed a figure in the landscape, it is almost as if that figure is representing the landscape and that consciousness being sort of co-equal, or in a state of symmetry, let's say. So a lot of what I'm thinking about in all of my works is the idea of witness. How the land witnesses what we do to it, how the universe witnesses what we do to it, and how we may, if we get a global, broader, cosmic perspective, also witness what we're doing and pay more attention to it. So I would say that there's actually if you look at the work, you're going to see images where the figures are really embedded and melting into the ground or being fully ensconced in the earth or in some sort of constructed form. And I think that those figures are ones who they're like solidified. Their embodiment is affirmed. And the figures that are sort of distal, who are pushed out from the earth, are figures that are in a state of flux or in a state of disintegration in some way. I think that you see that logic happening in work across basically the entire 20 years that's kind of represented here. Yes? Well, it's a double-edged sword, right? It's both nature red in tooth and claw, and the nature that is completely ignorant of us and does not care about us. And yet it is also the fact, and you can see this in a lot of different faith traditions, you can see this in Christianity, you can see this in many different places, that if I say, like I said a minute ago, that we are the universe seeing itself, we are the manifestation of the universe coming to itself in knowledge, then that means that while on a certain surface level, the universe is completely, it does not care about us.
Right.
And in another sense, we are the opportunity for the universe to care about itself.
So it isn't done.
It's not done.
Okay.
I would say that in many ways, this picture and the square one on the wall and behind, Tremendum Mundi, I think those three are all versions of the expulsion from the garden. They're versions of that story of us being denied what we have denied. We've denied a certain kind of potential and we've decided to step away from it, and then it's enforced, right? So I would say that it's not a nihilism. It's not an existentialist sense of emptiness. But it is a deep concern about WTF. It's like they're very concerned about what is happening and where things are going, and how often little incidents can relate to very gigantic existential situations. To answer the question in another way, when I did these 4 paintings back here with these plumes in the background,
Yes.
those are all from 2006, and they were my first response to the war. I had a great professor in grad school, Barry Geltz, at Indiana University, and he basically told the cohort that I was with, these 18 artists, he was like, you're in the middle of this. What are you going to do with it? Are you just going to make pretty pictures, or are you going to challenge what's happening? What are you going to think about it? And I didn't know how to answer him, and I don't know that he's known how to answer it. But in that grouping, I wanted to move from a kind of mythological idea of Sisyphus turning against himself and falling back down into this field of contention to maybe a little bit more of a pastoral scene with these figures, these sort of idealized women seeing this plume of horror. And then in the third one is almost like our real world. It's like, it's darkness, we see this omen, we see this portent of horror, but it's still a little bit more like allegorical. And then this last image is actually from the front page of the New York Times in 2006, in the city of Haifa in northern Israel, when Lebanon shot some Scuds down across over the border. And these 4 guys were standing up upon a height, looking down at their city, and seeing that omen become real. Seeing that impossible thing be real. The impossibility of being dead. The impossibility of being destroyed. Happening for real in front of them. And so it's that the sense of those things being co-equal, I guess, in my mind. The hope that there is this existential truth beyond all of these things that matters, and then this reality that, on the ground right now, why is the U.S. bombing me? I'm here just because my leg is broken and suddenly I'm dead. And now my family cannot get food. My wife cannot get food. What are they going to do about it? They're not going to do anything about it. So it's that kind of tension between those things. I don't know that I want to necessarily come down on one specific answer for it, but yeah. Yes? The geometric form that I'm using in there is one of Plato's 5 solids. It's the dodecahedron. It's the 5th element, the quintessential element. And in the Timaeus, Plato basically suggested that the universe was shaped like a dodecahedron. And so it was interesting, my wife and I spent a month in Italy in 2005, and we went to the Science Museum in Florence. And there was this whole amazing, and it had ancient stuff there, hundreds and hundreds of years old. It had objects that Galileo and Kepler had in their studios. And they were very fascinated with these geometric solids. And after that, when I went home, I started to think about how Plato talked about the dodecahedron being a representative of the universe. And I thought, you know what? I'm making all these statements, but I don't have any solid way of saying, this means this. So I decided to take the dodecahedron and I decided to cram it in to these landscapes to be a representative of the universe. So in some sense, in each of those 4 pictures, the dodecahedron is the witness of the universe to what we have done. So you see it come up again and again and again. It's in here. I'm suggesting the pentagon, which is part of the dodecahedron. It's here, kind of ghostly, appearing in the middle in this bifurcated space between different wings of the hospital. And I did it over and over and over again. Some places a little bit less specific, and other places more very precise. Yes? Yes. So the tethered tongue is actually very simple. It began with this idea of a plumb bob, how you take the plumb, you hold it out, it tells you what true vertical is. In other words, it tells you what's true. It tells you what's real. So is there a way to apply that to my own heart and mind, the things that I say, the things that I believe? Is there a way for me to use that is there any kind of logic, any kind of faith, any kind of belief that says this is real and this is true? And in an era of fake news and where literally people lie directly to you. They say one thing and 15 minutes later they say they didn't say it. And they get to run the free world. Basically, what I saw that as is a mechanism to make this comment and challenge myself. In fact, the first picture that I did it with is the one that's right around the corner on the title wall, Taming the Tongue, where I did a self-portrait of myself stumbling through this landscape and attempting to calibrate my mouth with the plumb bob. To calibrate what I know to be true by a standard that transcends me. That's essentially what I was trying to do. So in every situation where you see the tongue, you see that tethered tongue, that's a discipline. That's it's a hard discipline. To try to be right, to try to be good, to try to be honorable in the world. Yes? Yeah, I think that it's really important not to just be in an echo chamber, not to just be in a zone where everything you get is filtered through Facebook's algorithm or whatever. So for me, really what it is, it's since I was a little kid, being very interested in history. And of course, when I was 9 years old, I read through, my mother gave me a quarter for every one that I read, Time, Life, History of the United States, right? And of course, that has a perspective. That has a gendered and very specific perspective, a national perspective on how things are. But in that, you do start to see, some of the very first images that I remember as a budding artist were the political cartoons that people made in the United States around the time of the Revolution, how brutal and intense they were. And actually kind of pornographic and really intense. Right? So I think that for me it's been important to be a reader, to be a sort of, maybe what you might say to be a novice or a lay historian, to really go in and look at things and read. And like you're saying, primary sources are important. But one of the things that I learned when I was younger, in the first part of undergrad, was that people always told me to distrust anecdotal sources. But I actually think as I've lived, what you're saying is true. It's when you can speak to someone who has seen it, even if it is kind of calibrated to their assumptions and all of those things, like everything is, at least you get a real, honest, direct expression. And so, what I would say is that many of the things that I looked at for the Afghanistan series, and I have a show up of this stuff right now over in Franklin Pierce University in New Hampshire, which has 11 of these paintings. So there's 5 here and 11 out there. All of those sources were from videos, from documentary sources, primary sources, men and women who had been there on the site and taken those scenes and showed those things. And some of them are just really grainy, phone video. And maybe you can't know truth from that. But I think that you can know a perspective from that. And perspective is really everything. There's also something that I think that needs to come into it, which is, we are really teaching our daughters, our older daughters, how to write and how to think about how to tell something about the world. And they resist the iterative process, right? They resist that process of writing it more than once or looking at the information more than once. Of course, my undergrads also reject that too, but there's something really beautiful about when you look at something and then you look at it again and then you look at it again and then you look at it again and you get multiple points of view on it, those multiple perspectives, much like that old cliche of the blind men and the elephant. You actually triangulate something that's real through seeing it in those multiple ways. Many years ago, and I had a commission from a family who have been actually very helpful to us, and my wife has worked for their company for almost 20 years. One of their daughters was very interested in horses, and they had asked me to do some commissions. And so I had done a bunch of studies of horses, and basically what I wanted to do was give a little bit, in the context of this show, give a little bit of a nod to the history of the four horsemen. The horsemen of the apocalypse. The horsemen who bring pestilence and death. The horsemen who bring, like this sense of woe, this other kind of omen. So in a lot of these pictures, the omen is the plume of like this explosion that's happened, right? This plume that's happened in the distance, and you don't know what it means for you. And in fact, that imagery is in things like Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Like in that book, you don't even know what happened. But you do see in the distance the fires. You see in the distance the plume. And so what I thought of was like these horses being representative of like an oncoming onslaught, which is why I stuck them at the beginning to say like the war horses are here. Now let's go look at some stuff. Let's go look at some death. Let's go look at some strangely beautiful depictions. Part of what I want to do is like horses are beautiful, but they're also terrifying. When you're standing next to a horse, like it could kill you. And yet its muscularity and its power is very beautiful. It's similar when you look at, for instance, Werner Herzog, the filmmaker, German filmmaker, did a film in the aftermath of the first Iraq War when we were pushing people out of Kuwait. And the retreating Iraqi army had started all the oil fields on fire. And these huge plumes raised up into the atmosphere. And for literally like 18 months, there was a swath of this black cloud going around the earth. And he violated the UN no-fly rules. And he went in there and he documented it. And when you watch that film, it's called Lessons in Darkness. It was like a revelation to me because it's so beautiful and yet it is like stupendously destructive and horrific at the same time. It's literally it is hundreds of thousands of square miles covered in burning oil fields and huge plumes of smoke, and yet the way that he was able to document it is actually tremendously powerful and beautiful, and the colors are dramatic and amazing. And so that's a lesson that I took from Herzog. The other lesson that I took from Herzog is that he talks about this idea of the ecstatic truth being more important than truth. So the ecstatic truth is the thing that says more than what the truth itself would say. So none of these interiors are the exact interior of the hospital in Kunduz. None of them are one moment in that aftermath. But they are the truth. They are the ecstatic truth in terms of saying, look at what we have done. Look at how we have made the impossible possible. And that is something that's really important to me. So that's what those war horses are ushering in. Coming into those environments that you want to look at, even though they're horrific. And in some sense, I'm doing a disservice, because to actually be in front of like this body would be horrific and horrible. And yet I want us to be able to participate in the witness that it is. And so I try to do that through making it into a kind of icon of reality. Yes, I made them have sort of cataracts. Because war is pretty stupid. And attacking other people for scarcity is dumb, and it's counteractive, and it doesn't help. Why are we where we... Let me get on my high horse for a second. Try not to be political. Why are we where we are today? Because we lied to get ourselves into a situation from which we cannot extract ourselves. It's $6 trillion. Oh, but we can't pay for education or social safety nets or healthcare, but we can pay for $6 trillion of bombing people to help. That's the reality. We have decided that we're okay with that. And so part of what I'm trying to do is depict the insanity of that in a way that is accessible. So yeah, the horses are blind. The war horses are blind. They don't know where they're running to. The people here don't know if they're building the wall or tearing the wall down. Those people don't know if they're entering the graveyard or leaving the grave. Are these people falling away from a paradise, or are they leaving a zone of complete destruction? That's the question that's sort of posed and brought out. Yes? You know, these images all are, particularly the three main pastel drawings, big ones, they're all in a state of multiplicity. You are seeing surfaces from, 2007 on this, and you're seeing surfaces from, 2 weeks ago. So in some sense, there are states that are co-equal that actually represent different moments. But essentially, the image, when this figure came up, let me tell you a little bit of the narrative, the material narrative that's going on here. Originally, there was this figure, and he was dominant. He had this massive phallus, and the picture was too gendered. It was too heavily powerful. And this figure behind, she was emaciated. She was anorexic. She was starving. And I felt that it did not balance what I wanted. It didn't balance it out. So as I began to work with this figure, who is slightly more voluptuous and I lit the model to be much more colorful. And I imagined that what I would do is have a light source behind this figure to allow him to be in shadow, to sort of push him into a different space, and then allow her to come forward. And I think that she does, because I think that she represents a kind of fecundity and a kind of potential for hope. Ultimately, I decided not to go back in and transform that lighting situation, and I wanted to let her come forward. So in some sense, the co-equal relationship between the figure behind, who has disappeared, who was she was on the edge of death, she's on the edge of life, maybe. Is he holding on to like a destroyed zone, or is he trying to fight his way out of it? We don't know. So part of this is about like presenting these tensions and then deciding when it is time to display the tensions and see what happens. Well, isn't that intriguing? Because in some sense what she's doing is she's referencing that pentagonal shape, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe she's seeing through to something else that's not in this world. Maybe she's figured something out. There is this really interesting, anytime you look at images of either the creation of Eve or like the fall of man or the expulsion from the garden, there's usually the artist puts in some kind of like tongue-in-cheek thing. And recently I've been super obsessed with Hugo van der Gogh's Fall of Mankind. He is essentially saying that the apple, right, that carnal knowledge, is that she's pregnant. So Hugo van der Gogh doesn't think of the apple in the garden as some like existential sin that's about like some state of lack of grace. He's thinking of it as like, oh, this is when people learn how to make babies. Because literally the Eve is pregnant. And she's already offered that apple to Adam. So in some sense, I'm trying to sort of show that sort of tension between the fecundity and the potential sense of loss. Because Adam is always the dumbass in those situations. Like Adam is always I understand that historically in the church, particularly we have done things to make Eve be the bad guy, right? And we've interpreted it that way. But when you actually look at the information, it's like Adam's like the dumbass, right? And so trying to sort of send that message, that duality, maybe she sees something real. The Penitent Wanderer. Yeah. This is from the end of my time at Indiana University. And this structure actually exists. Sometimes you can see it down in Bloomington, Indiana. There's this dog park. And I went down there and I expected that the second that I drew it, my professors would be like, get away from that. Everybody paints that. Stop doing that. Because that's what they say. There are like 3 areas around Bloomington that all the painters go and paint. And you know, when you've been teaching there for 40 years and you see the 4,000th picture of the quarry, you're like, please stop painting that. But nobody had done it before, because when I was there, they had actually closed the sluice. So like, this is normally like full of water up high. I went down there and I drew, and I kind of drew a picture of, it's almost a self-portrait. It's like the feeling of being at the end. When I graduated from grad school, my wife and I, my wonderful wife, Allison, had helped me to apply to over 120 jobs. And I did not get a job. I applied to this job, and I didn't get a job. It was 2 years later that they finally called me back, and I've been here ever since. But that's basically a self-portrait of that feeling of like, you do your penance, you try to do your best, and you are left with no water. You're left with no sustenance. You're left with a trickle, right? That happens sometimes in life. In the same way that this is like completely abstract in some way, that's super literal. So, yes? I mean, I think it's probably both, right? As artists, we are always... There is no artist who makes images that are not about understanding how to make images, right? Everybody's always trying to figure it out. That's actually the joy of being a professor, is that you witness people working out how to do the things they want to do. They learn through the doing. There's nothing I can teach them. I can put strategies in their way. I can put situations in their way that I think, and it's, you know, in my experience, have worked in the past. Like, I do things that cause them to make choices that will make them better, right? I can't make them be better. And similarly, none of us knows what to do with everything that's going on. If somebody tells you they know what the hell is happening, they are off. Okay? It is insanity out there, people. It is crazy. And there's always more to know. There's always more to inflect what is happening and what could be happening. There's, you know, like one of the things I love is that with many of my students, I have been forced to tackle my own assumptions, to challenge my own way of thinking, and I honor that. Like, I believe in that, and that's because way back when I first took this job in 2007, I realized within a few months that teaching scratched the same itch as image making did. That teaching did for me what making paintings did. So suddenly, in my life, I get paid to like talk to people about art, to challenge people, to be in the way of people. And that does for me, that creative juice of trying to figure out how to be present for them and to give them that just little bit of encouragement or to put that weird thing in the way of them is just exactly what I do for myself with my painting, with my drawing, with my printmaking. That challenge is like central to what I'm doing. So that, yeah, I think that the image is a challenge, and it is a solution to the challenge. So, I mean, from the very beginning, like Mr. Fanning, to Mrs. Goodwill in 2nd grade, to Mrs. Cobb in 3rd grade, to Mrs. Lyon and Mr. Resnick, all the way up through to Lisa Gregg Whitman at Pratt, who was one of my printmaking teacher and my drawing teacher, to Barry and Eve and Bonnie and Tim at Indiana University. But it even goes back to like core relationships with people who transform you. I've had students and grads who I still interact with all the time who have transformed me and put pressure on me, and we have to be receptive to that pressure. So I try to pay that forward with my students as well. I'm the director of undergraduate studies for the art department, which is a gigantic, huge job, and it's constant all the time. And yet I get a lot of, I'm working with a student to figure out how to make the most of their time and to get the most out of it. And I love that. I mean, would I prefer to be painting? Probably. But I do enjoy that part of it. Anything else? Yeah. All of it. Everything. Thank you very much, guys.